Everyone laughed when they gave me the worst class in the kingdom. 6 months later, I stood on a field of my own churned earth and watched a Kestrel Empire siege tower, 40 feet of reinforced timber, built to crack open a city gate, sink axle deep into mud that hadn't existed a heartbeat earlier. Roots wrapped around its wheels like the ground itself had been waiting years for permission to be angry. I want to tell you I always knew it would come to this. That some quiet, secret confidence carried me from that humiliating ceremony floor to a battlefield where I dictated the terms an invading army fought on. That would be a comforting lie, and comforting lies aren't why you're listening to this. The truth is smaller and stranger, and took a lot longer to earn than a single triumphant afternoon. It started with 3 acres of flooded, worthless tenant land nobody else wanted, a locked skill with a name nobody in the modern kingdom remembered, and a joke of a class that an entire graduating class laughed at without bothering to ask what it actually meant. Let me start there. Let me start with the laughter. Chapter 1. The Ceremony of Shame. Everyone laughed when the array called my name. Not a polite laugh, not the nervous kind you give a stranger's bad joke. A full, rolling wave of it, rising from 300 throats at once, bouncing off the marble walls of the hollow spire like it had been rehearsed. I stood there in the center of the ceremony floor, 16 years of quiet dignity dissolving into a single, glowing word above my head. I remember thinking, stupidly, that the letter should have looked different for something this humiliating. Maybe red, maybe cracked. Instead, they hung there in the same clean gold light as everyone else's, as if the system itself didn't understand what it had just done to me. Let me back up. My name is Kaito Mizuno, or it was in this life. In the one before, the one with concrete cities and combustion engines and soil sensors, my name was different, and it doesn't matter anymore, because that man died on a rain-slicked highway with a truck full of grain seed in his trunk and 40 years of agricultural research in his skull. I remember dying. I remember the headlights. I remember, less clearly, the sensation of being unmade and then remade, like a seed cracking open in the dark. And then I was 6 years old, in a farmhouse on the edge of a kingdom that didn't exist on any map I recognized, crying for a mother I'd never met before, but somehow already loved. Reincarnation isn't clean. It isn't a save file loading. It's fragments, dreams that feel like memories, memories that feel like dreams, a phantom itch of knowledge you can't always reach until the moment you need it. I didn't wake up on day 1 shouting equations about nitrogen fixation. It came in pieces, a smell of turned soil that made my chest ache with a longing I didn't understand until I was 9. The certainty, at 11, that the fallow field behind our house was dying because of drainage, not curses, though everyone around me swore it was a curse. My grandfather was the only one who believed me when I fixed it with a shovel and 3 weeks of stubborn digging instead of a priest and a blood offering. "You've got old eyes, boy," he told me once, watching me stare at a compost pile like it held the secrets of the universe. "Older than your body." He wasn't wrong. He just didn't know how right he was. So when I turned 17, the age every citizen of the Verandine Dominion faces the Genesis array and receives their class, I wasn't afraid the way the other kids were afraid. I wasn't hoping for Blade Saint or Stormcaller or any of the flashy S ranks the nobility's children were groomed for since birth. I just wondered, quietly, what a system built on raw soul potential would make of a man who'd spent 1 lifetime in a laboratory studying root systems, and 1 lifetime as a farmhand who somehow always knew exactly when to water and when to wait. I did not expect Farmer. I did not expect the entire graduating class of Aldrich Academy, 300 bright, ambitious, thoroughly aristocratic teenagers, to turn as one and stare at me like I'd been diagnosed with a disease. "Farmer," someone repeated, savoring it. That was Lord Cassius Wainwright, blonde and perfect, and cruel in the specific way only inherited wealth can manufacture. They gave the transfer scholarship kid a farmer class. Gods, that's almost poetic. More laughter. Someone, I didn't turn to see who, made a joke about manure that got a bigger reaction than it deserved. I want to tell you I stood there with icy composure, unbothered, secretly smug about the truth only I could sense. That would be a lie. My ears burned, my hands at my sides curled into fists hard enough that my nails left crescents in my palms. 17 years of being the scholarship kid, the quiet kid, the kid who didn't quite belong in a school built for the children of knights and merchants and minor nobility. And now I had a title to match. Farmer. Rank F. The lowest tier the array issued, reserved historically for support roles nobody wanted. Cooks, weavers, and now, apparently, me. Only 3 people in that entire hall weren't laughing. The first was Elena Whitmore, the Academy's junior healer in training, standing near the dais with her arms crossed and her brow furrowed in a way that had nothing to do with amusement. She was staring at the glowing status window above my head with the focused intensity of someone reading fine print everyone else had skipped. I didn't understand why then. I would, later. The second was Sora Kagami, technically not even a student, a licensed hunter, 23 years old, silver-haired and scarred, invited as an observer because the academy liked to show its graduating class what real adventurers look like. She wasn't laughing either. She was watching me with the flat, assessing look of a woman who had seen 100 overconfident S-ranks die screaming and had learned, the hard way, not to judge power by its packaging. The third was Arya Langley. I don't need to describe Arya Langley to you slowly, building suspense, because everyone in that hall already knew exactly who she was. Arya Langley, whose class had been called 40 minutes earlier to a standing ovation. Dawnblade, rank SS. The single highest classification this academy had produced in a generation. Silver hair, storm grey eyes, the kind of unfair beauty that made poets weep and rivals despair, and a swordsmanship talent that had drawn recruitment offers from 3 royal orders before she'd even finished her acceptance speech. She wasn't laughing either, but she wasn't looking at me with pity or curiosity like the other 2. She was looking at me with something closer to confusion, like a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture on the box, and it bothered her that it didn't fit. I would spend the next year discovering exactly why. The ceremony itself, before my name was called, had been a parade of exactly the outcomes everyone expected. Cassius Wainwright had gone first, naturally, because the Wainwright family had endowed half the academy's training halls, and nobody had ever considered that fact a coincidence. The golden text had barely finished forming before the hall erupted into applause his family had clearly paid for in advance. 3 rows of relatives on their feet, his mother weeping theatrical tears of pride. Then came a string of B and C ranks, respectable, forgettable, the broad middle of the academy's graduating class shuffling through with polite applause and quiet relief. A few rank D outcomes drew murmured pity. Then Arya Langley's name was called, and the entire hall went silent, in the particular way a crowd goes silent right before it explodes. I remember the sound the hall made. Not applause, at first, a kind of collective gasp, like everyone had been holding their breath for this exact moment without admitting it to themselves. Then the applause came, thunderous, sustained. 3 separate faculty members already whispering to each other about royal recruitment protocols before Arya had even stepped down from the dais. She'd taken it with a composure that looked, from where I stood at the back of the alphabetical line, less like triumph and more like exhaustion, as if she'd known this outcome was coming her whole life and had simply been waiting for the formality to catch up to the expectation. I was near the very end of the roster. Mizuno, near the tail of an alphabet that put me behind nearly everyone else, which meant I have the singular agonizing experience of watching 290 classmates receive their classes before mine, each result narrowing the field of possibilities down further and further until the only genuinely rare outcomes left unclaimed were the very best and the very worst. I told myself, standing there, that I didn't care which end of that spectrum I landed on. I told myself a lot of things that day that turned out not to be true. Class registered, farmer, F rank, base stats, STR8, VIT 9, INT 14, WIS 11, LUK 7. Innate skill unlocked, sovereign soil locked, requirements not met. I saw that notification and nearly laughed myself bitterly. Sovereign soil locked. Of course it was locked. Of course the one skill attached to my joke of a class came with a padlock and no key. I didn't know, standing there with my ears burning and my dignity in ruins, that the lock wasn't a cruelty. It was a filter. The array doesn't waste high-tier abilities on people who can't use them, and Farmer, in its true form, was never meant for people who saw dirt as dirt. It was meant for someone who saw a field the way I did, as a living system, a network of roots and water and pressure and patience, waiting for someone who understood its language to finally ask it to speak. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew, walking out of that hall with laughter still ringing behind me, was that I had exactly one friend at Aldrich Academy, a boy named Toma who worked kitchen shifts with me, and now apparently I was going to spend the rest of my educational career known as the Farmer. The walk home took me through the lower town, past the market stalls closing for evening, and the guild board where posted bounties competed for space with tax notices, past the estate wall that separated the noble quarter from the tenant lots where families like mine, families that farmed the land instead of owning it, had lived for 3 generations without ever crossing that boundary in the other direction. Nobody in the lower town had heard about the ceremony results yet. For a few more hours, I was still just Kaito, the scholarship boy, unremarkable in the way that had always felt, at least, like a kind of safety. I went home that night to the tenant plot my grandfather left me at the edge of town. 3 acres of half-neglected soil the estate hadn't bothered reclaiming because it bordered the old boundary wall and flooded twice a season. More trouble than it was worth to anyone with better land to manage. The farmhouse itself was small, single-story, its roof patched in 3 different eras of shingle by 3 different pairs of hands. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the dark field beyond it, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel underneath the humiliation still burning in my chest. Curiosity. I sat on the low stone fence separating my land from the wilderness beyond it, and I did something none of the laughing nobles in that hall would have thought to do. I stopped performing dignity for an audience that wasn't there anymore, and I let myself actually think about the word farmer instead of just flinching from it. In my old life, farming had never been a joke to me. It had been the thing I'd given 40 years to. Soil chemistry, crop rotation science, hydrology, the slow, unglamorous, essential work of feeding people who never thought about where their food came from until it stopped arriving. Nobody laughed at agricultural engineers at conferences. Nobody called it the lowest tier of anything, not when droughts hit and half a continent's food security depended on people who understood exactly what I'd understood. Maybe, I thought, sitting there in the dark with my anger cooling into something more analytical, the joke wasn't the class. Maybe the joke was that an entire hall full of people had been trained their whole lives to worship swords and lightning and flashy destruction, and had never once considered that the ground beneath their feet might have its own kind of power, waiting for someone who actually understood how to ask. I put my palm flat against the earth, and the earth, for the first time in this life, answered. Innate resonance detected. Sovereign soil, partial unlock. Tier 1, root speak. New skill, root speak, passive. You perceive the health, composition, and structure of soil and root systems within a 30-meter radius. Range increases with class rank. 30 meters, that's what the system gave me that first night. 30 meters of dirt I could suddenly see, not with my eyes but with something underneath them, a sense I'd had flickers of in my old life and only now, fully, felt bloom open like a flower forcing through concrete. I felt every root under that field. I felt the compacted clay 6 feet down that had been drowning this soil for a decade. I felt the old irrigation channel my grandfather had dug and abandoned, half collapsed, choked with silt. I felt, impossibly, potential. The way a doctor feels a pulse and knows a patient isn't actually dying, just sick, just neglected, just waiting for the right hands. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just sat there in the dark with my palm on the ground, and for the first time since the array had humiliated me in front of 300 people, I felt something other than shame. I felt hungry. Not for revenge, not yet. Just for the simple, addictive certainty that whatever this class was, whatever the mocking laughter thought it understood about the word farmer, none of them had the faintest idea what they'd actually mocked. They'd laughed at a locked door. They had no idea what was standing behind it. Chapter 2. Root Speak. The first week I told no one. Not Elena, who kept giving me strange, considering looks in the healing hall corridor like she wanted to ask a question she hadn't fully formed yet. Not Sora, who I hadn't spoken to at all and had no reason to expect ever would. Certainly not Arya Langley, who existed in a social orbit so far removed from mine that our paths crossing felt like astronomy rather than acquaintance. I told no one because I didn't trust it yet. A 30-meter sense of soil health sounds like a parlor trick until you understand what it actually means for someone who spent a previous lifetime studying exactly this. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't relying on half-remembered lecture notes about nitrogen cycles and mycorrhizal networks. I could feel the field the way a surgeon feels a patient's pulse under 2 fingers. Immediate, total, undeniable. So instead of telling anyone, I worked. Skill unlocked, cultivator's patience, passive, growth tick intervals for tended crops and flora reduced by 40% when cultivated within root speak range. 40% doesn't sound like much until you realize what it actually meant in practice. Seeds that should have taken 6 days to sprout broke soil in 3.5. A grain stalk that should have needed 11 weeks to mature stood ready for harvest in less than 7. I tested it obsessively, alone, at night, terrified someone would see and ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I planted a row of barley on the western edge of my grandfather's field on a Monday. By the following Monday, it stood waist-high, heavy-headed, and utterly, impossibly ready for cutting. A normal barley crop takes 90 days. Mine took 7. I stood in that field at dawn, staring at grain that shouldn't exist yet, and felt the particular vertigo of a man who has just realized the joke everyone made at his expense was, in fact, aimed at the wrong target entirely. I spent the rest of that week testing the boundaries of what RootSpeak actually let me perceive, cataloging it the way I imagined my old life self would have cataloged a research grant's worth of field data. Except this time the instruments were my own nerves, and the data came in as sensation rather than numbers. I learned I could tell, without digging, exactly where the clay layer sat beneath any point in my 3 acres. I learned I could feel moisture gradients the way a weather-worn farmer might feel rain coming in his joints, except mine were accurate to the hour. I learned that the old, half-collapsed irrigation channel my grandfather had abandoned decades ago wasn't beyond saving. It was choked, not broken. And 3 days of careful clearing brought water flowing through it for the first time in longer than I'd been alive. Skill refined. RootSpeak now includes moisture mapping and mineral density sensing within active range. Every small victory came with a quiet, private satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong. For the first time since I'd woken up in this body, this life, I felt like the 2 halves of me, the tired, brilliant agronomist who'd died on a highway, and the quiet, overlooked farm boy who'd inherited his memories, were finally, actually the same person, instead of a stranger wearing borrowed knowledge like an ill-fitting coat. The only person at the academy I told about the barley in those early days was Toma, the one friend the mockery hadn't managed to scare off, a broad-shouldered kitchen shift boy with a rank D baker class and an easy, unbothered laugh that made the academy's social hierarchy feel a little less suffocating whenever we worked the same shift. 7 days, Toma repeated when I told him, not quite believing it. We were elbow-deep in dishwater in the academy's kitchen annex, the one place in that entire institution where nobody cared what class you'd been assigned as long as you scrubbed the pots properly. Barley in 7 days. Kaito, that's not a thing that happens. My grandmother farmed for 30 years, and she'd have called that witchcraft. I don't think it's witchcraft, I said, which was true, though I didn't have a better explanation to offer him yet. Whatever it is, don't tell Wainwright's crowd. Toma's easy humor sobered for a moment. They spent a week calling you a joke. If they find out the joke's actually doing something they can't explain, half of them will decide it's cheating before they decide it's impressive. He bumped my shoulder with his, back to grinning. For what it's worth, I never thought farmer was a bad class. My family's been baking bread for 4 generations. Somebody's got to grow the grain that goes into it. Seems like a pretty important job to me, whatever the ceremony crowd thinks. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't Elena's careful diagnostic curiosity or Sora's tactical recruitment pitch, but Toma's easy, unbothered loyalty, the simple fact that he'd never once needed proof of hidden power to treat my class with basic respect, mattered more to me in that first difficult month than either of us ever really said out loud. Class growth threshold reached. Sovereign Soil, Tier 2, Unlocking, Root Anchor. Root Anchor, active. Command root systems within root speak range to grip, hold, or restrain physical objects and creatures. Strength scales with soil health and INT. I tested that one on an old, half-rotted fence post first, out of caution more than curiosity. I planted my palm against the dirt, focused the way something in the back of my mind, some old-life muscle memory of concentration, told me to focus, and pulled. The post didn't just fall. It was devoured. Roots I couldn't even see erupted from the soil around its base, wrapped it in seconds, and dragged it 3 inches into the earth like the ground itself had decided the post eyed it something. I sat down hard in the dirt, laughing. Actual laughter. The first real laughter I'd felt since the humiliation of the ceremony, because I understood, finally, viscerally, what farmer actually meant on this array. It wasn't a class for growing turnips. It was a class for a man who could make the earth itself into a weapon, an ally, a living extension of his will, if, and only if, he understood soil the way I did. Which meant it was, structurally, a class that could only ever have one true master in this entire kingdom, because no one else alive carried 40 years of agricultural obsession folded into their soul. I didn't tell anyone yet, but I stopped feeling ashamed. It was Elena Whitmore who found out first, and not because I told her. It happened on a supply run to the border market, 3 weeks after the ceremony. I'd gone to sell surplus grain. My grandfather's field was producing at a rate that made no sense to anyone but me, and I needed coin for tools and seed stock more advanced than what a tenant farmer's budget usually allowed. Elena was there buying medicinal herbs for the healing hall, and she recognized me before I saw her. "Kaito Mizuno," she said, in the tone of someone testing whether a name still applied to the person attached to it. "The farmer." "That's me," I said, careful, neutral. She looked at the cart behind me, barley stacked in sacks, more than any half-flooded 3-acre plot should produce in a season, let alone 3 weeks. And her healer's eyes did something I'd come to recognize later as a diagnostic look. The one she used on patients whose symptoms didn't match their stated illness. "That's a lot of grain for someone with a rank F support class," she said slowly. "Hard work," I said. "Kaito." She stepped closer, dropping her voice, glancing around the market to make sure no one was listening. "I read status windows for a living. I've read hundreds of them. Healing hall interns, hunters coming through with injuries, nobles showing off. I saw your class window at the ceremony before it minimized." Her eyes were sharp, careful, not unkind. "Pharma classes don't get 4 skill slots at rank F. They get 1, maybe 2 if the soul potential is unusually high. Yours had a locked skill with a name I've never seen before in any registry. Sovereign Soil." She let that word sit between us. "That's not a support class name. That's a Dominion class name." I didn't answer for a long moment. The market noise went on around us, oblivious. "What do you want from me?" I asked, finally, because I'd learned enough about this world to know that people rarely brought you information for free. Elena's expression shifted, something almost hurt crossing it. "Nothing. I want to know what's growing on your land, because if it's what I think it is, you're going to need a healer who already knows your secret before you accidentally kill yourself pushing a class you don't fully understand yet." She paused. "I've seen overextension before, awakened classes that grow too fast for the body carrying them. I'd rather be ready for that than read about your funeral in a gazette." It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was clinical, careful, healer's pragmatism. But it was also, I realized later, the first crack in the wall of mockery the world had built around me, the first person who looked at farmer and saw a mystery worth investigating instead of a joke worth repeating. "Come see the field," I told her, "but you keep this quiet." She agreed, and true to her word, she came the following evening after her healing hall shift ended, still in her pale blue apprentice robes, medical satchel slung over one shoulder like she hadn't quite decided whether this was a social visit or a professional consultation. I walked her the perimeter of the 3 acres, showing her the barley, already through its second impossible growth cycle, and the cleared irrigation channel, and the corner of the field where I'd been quietly, cautiously testing root anchor on increasingly stubborn objects. She crouched at the edge of the tilled soil, pressing 2 fingers into the dirt the way she might check a patient's pulse, eyes distant in a way I recognized later as her mana-sensing focus. "This soil is saturated with residual mana density I've only ever seen in old battlefield sites," she said slowly. "Sites where something significant happened generations ago and the land never fully let go of it." She looked up at me. "Do you know anything about this land's history? Before your grandfather?" I didn't, not then. Neither of us guessed how directly that question would matter within the year. "I want to keep monitoring this," Elena said, standing, brushing dirt from her knees with the brisk efficiency of someone already mentally filing this under ongoing research. "Not to expose you. To understand it before it becomes a problem you can't manage alone." She hesitated, and something more personal slipped through the clinical tone. "For what it's worth, I didn't laugh at the ceremony because status windows don't lie about potential, even when the label attached to them does. I knew something was strange the moment I saw yours. I just didn't expect this strange." It wasn't friendship yet that evening, but it was the first honest conversation I'd had with anyone at that academy who wasn't either mocking me or awkwardly avoiding the subject. And I found myself walking her back toward the town road afterward, genuinely reluctant to see her go. She agreed. I didn't know yet that keeping my secret quiet was a promise about to become very, very difficult to honor. Chapter 3. The Huntress Who Saw Past the Rank. Sora Kagami found me the way experienced hunters find anything worth finding, by following the trail everyone else ignored. She'd noticed the barley shipments too. Hunters' guild registries tracked regional grain output as a matter of course, since famine and siege logistics were part of the job. And when a tenant plot flag for flood damage started outproducing estate farms 3 times its size, she came to look for herself instead of asking questions in town. I found her sitting on my grandfather's fence when I came out at dawn, silver hair catching the early light, a short sword resting casually across her knees like she'd been there for hours and had nowhere better to be. "You're the bomber," she said, not a question. I studied her for a moment before answering. Sora Kagami had the kind of presence that made you catalog details automatically. The healed scar along her jaw that spoke of a fight she'd survived rather than avoided. The way her short sword sat at her hip like an extension of her hand rather than a tool she'd strapped on. The guild insignia on her shoulder marking her as a silver rank hunter, 1 tier below the rare gold classification reserved for adventurers who'd survived encounters most people never lived to describe. "You're the hunter who watched me get laughed at during the ceremony," I said, because 2 could play the flat statement game. A corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "I've watched a lot of ceremonies. Most of the laughing crowds turn out to be right about the person they're laughing at." She hopped down off the fence, boots crunching in frost-hardened dirt. "You're the first field I've walked in 15 years of contract work that felt alive under my feet before I even reached the boundary marker. That's not something a rank F class does." I considered lying. I considered the careful, cautious silence I'd been keeping since the ceremony. But Sora Kagami had the kind of steady, unimpressed presence that made pretense feel exhausting rather than protective. "What do you actually want?" I asked instead. She studied me for a long moment, assessing, the way I imagined she assessed every job offer and every monster contract before deciding whether it was worth her blade. "I want a partner," she said finally. "Not a client, not a charity case. A partner with a class that does something no other hunter in this region can replicate, working a piece of land that happens to sit directly on the flood corridor the Verandin border defense has been quietly worried about for 3 years. That caught my attention in a way grain prices never had. Flood corridor? The Verandin Dominion isn't a large kingdom, Sora said, settling back against the fence post like she'd told this history before and expected to tell it again. Barely 2 million souls wedged between the Kestrel Empire to the east and the free trading cities to the west. We survive the way small kingdoms usually survive, by being more trouble to conquer than we're worth, and by controlling exactly the kind of terrain that makes an invading army's life miserable. Mountain passes, river crossings. She gestured at the wet, half-flooded ground beneath us. Flood corridors, where an army's supply wagons sink to the axles the moment the rains come, and where the old border wall, 200 years dead, still sits directly across the only reasonably flat approach for 6 miles in either direction. And the Kestrel Empire wants through it. The Kestrel Empire, Sora said, has wanted through this valley for 3 centuries. They tried once, when this wall was new, and lost an entire vanguard to exactly the kind of terrain problem you're standing on right now. They haven't forgotten. Empires don't forget border humiliations. They just wait for a generation that thinks it's finally strong enough to erase them. You know the old boundary wall your land backs onto? Sora's expression sobered. That's not decoration. It's the last remaining piece of a border fortification built 2 centuries ago, back when the Kestrel Empire's predecessor tried to march an army through this exact valley. Guild scouts have picked up increased Empire troop movement along the eastern passes for the last 6 months. Nobody officially is saying the word invasion yet, because nobody wants to cause a panic before they're sure. But I'd been doing this long enough to trust the pattern over the politics. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not fear, exactly, but the specific dread of a man realizing the quiet, humiliating life he'd resigned himself to was about to become considerably less quiet. And you think my field matters to that? I think, Sora said, that a farmer who can make barley mature in a week and root systems grip a fence post hard enough to snap it clean off is sitting on the single most defensible choke point in this entire valley and doesn't know it yet. She held out a hand, an actual formal offer, hunter to hunter, even though I technically held no hunter license at all. I'd rather train you properly than read about your death in next season's guild casualty report. I looked at her hand for a long moment. Then I looked past her, toward the old boundary wall, and, with root speak humming quietly at the edge of my senses, felt for the first time the ancient foundation stones buried beneath 2 centuries of neglected soil. Felt the roots of trees older than the kingdom itself, tangled through collapsed masonry, waiting. I shook her hand. New party member, Sora Kagami. Shared quest unlocked, the sleeping wall. There was paperwork involved too, in the unglamorous way every life-changing moment eventually is. Sora walked me through the Hunters Guild's provisional registration process the following week. A temporary bronze rank license, technically beneath even the lowest combat classification, but enough to make our partnership official in the Guild's eyes. And enough, more importantly, to put my name on record as someone actively training for the border defense, rather than an unaffiliated civilian the Guild had no formal reason to protect or inform. Bronze rank isn't an insult, Sora said, watching me read over the license with obvious disappointment at the low tier stamped across it. It's a starting point. I made silver in 4 years. Some hunters take a decade. You've got something most of them never get. A class nobody else in this kingdom can currently replicate, and a teacher who's not going to let you waste it out of impatience. She tapped the license. Guard that number jealously. It's the only thing standing between you and the guild bureaucracy that would otherwise have no idea what to do with a farmer who fights. I kept that provisional license folded in my coat pocket for the rest of that year, a small, unglamorous scrap of official recognition that meant more to me some days than the golden ceremony announcement ever had. Training with Sora was nothing like I expected. I'd assumed, foolishly, that a hunter would teach me combat, swordplay, footwork, the kind of martial competence every noble-born student at Aldrich Academy trained in from childhood, while I scrubbed kitchen pots for scholarship credit. Instead, on our first real session, she sat me down in the dirt of my own field and made me map it. Your class isn't a weapon you swing, she said, pacing the boundary of the 30-meter root speak radius like she was testing its edges physically. It's a weapon you think. Every hunter I've ever respected wins fights before the fight starts, by understanding terrain better than the enemy does. You don't need to learn to swing a sword, Kaito. You need to learn to make every battlefield you stand on into your sword. She had me practice root anchor on increasingly difficult targets, not fence posts anymore, but stone, packed gravel, eventually a discarded practice dummy weighted with iron. I failed more than I succeeded, at first. Root anchor on stone required a completely different mental grip than root systems interfacing with wood or flesh. I had to relearn, painstakingly, exactly how far my authority over soil actually extended. Skill refined. Root anchor now recognizes mineral substrates within root speak range. Effectiveness against non-organic matter, 60% of organic baseline. 60% isn't nothing, Sora said when I reported the number to her, faintly embarrassed. 60% of a siege tower's foundation gripping wrong is a siege tower that tips over before it reaches your wall. She pushed me harder after that, in ways that had nothing to do with brute repetition and everything to do with precision. She had me practice sensing the difference between packed gravel and loose gravel with my eyes closed, between healthy topsoil and soil poisoned by old bottle residue, between a root system strong enough to anchor a fence post and one that would snap under the weight of a war machine. Your class isn't about how hard you can pull, she told me more than once. It's about how precisely you understand what you're pulling on. A hunter who swings a sword without understanding an enemy's stance is dead in 3 exchanges. A farmer who commands roots without understanding what's actually buried underneath them is going to anchor the wrong thing at the worst possible moment. I failed enough times during those weeks to understand exactly what she meant. Once, testing root anchor against a training dummy weighted unevenly, I misjudged the mass distribution and the roots gripped one leg far harder than the other, snapping the dummy's frame sideways instead of holding it still. Sora didn't console me. She made me run the test again and again until I stopped guessing and started actually reading the object before I committed force to it. Good, she said, the first time I got it clean. Just that, one word. From Sora Kagami, I'd learn, one word of approval carried the weight of another person's entire speech. That was the first time anyone had said the word siege directly to me, rather than dancing around empire troop movements and quiet worry. I felt the weight of it settle differently than the abstract dread from before, concrete now, specific, aimed at a wall on my land, defended, apparently, by my class. How much time do we have? I asked. Sora's face, usually composed, showed something almost like grief for a moment. Guild estimates put the earliest empire push at 4 to 6 months. I've learned not to trust guild estimates. I'd plan for less. I looked at my field, barley stalks swaying gold in afternoon light, roots humming quiet and vast beneath the soil, a fortification 2 centuries dead waiting patiently to wake, and felt the shape of a purpose forming that had nothing to do with proving Cassius Wainwright wrong at the ceremony. It had to do with the people behind that wall who had no idea how thin their protection actually was. My first real test came sooner than either of us expected, and it came from the wilderness beyond the wall rather than the empire. Sora had warned me early in our training that the boundary between cultivated farmland and the untended wilds beyond the old wall wasn't just a matter of property lines. Land nobody actively tends starts attracting things, she'd said. Monsters follow mana density the way flies follow rot. A field this saturated with dormant root sovereign mana, sitting this close to unclaimed wilderness, was always going to draw attention eventually. I just didn't expect it this early. It came on a grey afternoon 3 weeks into our partnership. A bog wraith, Sora called it once she'd gotten a clear look. A hulking mass of waterlogged plant matter and stolen bone that had drifted down from the flood marshes further east, drawn, apparently, by the unusual richness of my cultivated soil. I felt it before I saw it, the way root speak had started flagging genuinely wrong things within its radius, not injured animals or ordinary pests, but something that felt, through the ground, like a wound moving toward me on 4 broken angled legs.
That's not a training exercise, Sora said grimly, already drawing her blade.
That's a silver threat monster, and it's heading straight for the eastern edge of your barley. I didn't have combat instincts. I had 17 years of farming, 5 months of half-understood system notifications, and a hunter beside me who'd clearly rather I stayed well behind her. But the bog wraith was moving through my field, across ground I'd spent months learning like the back of my own hand, and something in me, old life stubbornness maybe, the same refusal to watch good soil get wasted that had once made me argue with the university board about drainage funding, refused to simply stand back and let Sora handle it alone. I can slow it, I said. Kaito. I was already moving, palm hitting churned earth at the field's edge, reaching for root anchor with a focus sharpened by weeks of Sora's relentless drilling. The wraith's legs weren't flesh in any conventional sense, waterlogged reeds and bog matter bound together by malevolent, hungry mana, but root speak read them anyway, found the places where root and reed matter overlapped and gripped. Root anchor applied to non-standard biological composite. Effectiveness variable. Continued exposure may refine skill parameters. The wraith shrieked, a wet, tearing sound, and lurched sideways as its forward legs locked into soil that refused to release them. It wasn't a clean stop. One leg tore free in a spray of black ichor, and for one terrifying second the creature surged forward anyway, three-legged and furious, close enough that I could smell the rot coming off it. Sora closed the distance in that same second, blade flashing once, twice, precise cuts aimed at the mana-dense core visible through a gap in its waterlogged chest, and the thing collapsed into a shapeless heap of reed and bone that stopped moving entirely. I sat down hard in the dirt afterward, hands shaking, adrenaline draining out of me all at once. Sora crouched beside me, wiping her blade clean with practiced calm, though I noticed her hands weren't entirely steady either. "That was reckless," she said. "It worked. It worked this time." She sheathed her sword and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not quite approval, not quite worry. Something caught between the two. "You didn't hesitate. Most people freeze the first time something like that comes at them, trained or not. You didn't." She exhaled slowly. "Doesn't mean you get to do that again without backup, but it means something." Skill refined. Root anchor now recognizes composite and non-organic biological matter. Combat growth threshold reached. Sovereign soil advancing toward Tier 3. I looked at my field, barley stalks swaying gold in afternoon light, roots humming quiet and vast beneath the soil, a fortification 2 centuries dead waiting patiently to wake, and felt the shape of a purpose forming that had nothing to do with proving Cassius Wainwright wrong at the ceremony. It had to do with the people behind that wall who had no idea how thin their protection actually was. Chapter 4. The girl the whole kingdom watched. I didn't expect to be the one who saved Arya Langley. Nobody expected that, least of all her. It happened 5 months after the ceremony, in early spring, on a day that started with nothing more dramatic than Elena Whitmore visiting to check the mana density readings she'd started tracking in my soil. A habit she'd developed after our market conversation turned into regular, cautious visits, then genuine friendship, then something neither of us had named yet, but both of us noticed. The academy had sent an advanced field training cohort to the border region for practical terrain experience, which was administrator speak for let the S-rank prodigies test their skills somewhere real before the war starts. Arya Langley, Dawnblade, was leading a squad of 6 through the exact stretch of wilderness bordering my grandfather's field when the terrain did something none of the academy's textbooks had prepared them for. A Kestrel Empire scouting force, 12 armed soldiers and a battle mage, far more than a training exercise should ever encounter, ambushed them at the edge of the flood corridor. I felt it before I saw it. Rootspeak had grown considerably since those first 30 meters. Months of deliberate, obsessive cultivation had pushed my range past 100 meters, and what I felt through the soil that afternoon was violence. Boots crushing frost-brittle grass, blood soaking into dirt, the specific vibration of steel meeting steel that no amount of description had prepared me to recognize instinctively, and yet somehow I did. Hostile combat detected within extended Rootspeak range. Quest available. Blood in the soil. I didn't stop to think. I ran. By the time I reached the edge of the field, 3 of Arya's squad were down. Not dead, I'd learned later, but badly wounded. One of them, a boy named Petrin, who'd sat 2 rows behind me in tactics class and had never once joined in the mockery. And Arya herself, blade blazing with the golden light her class was named for, stood alone against the remaining 9 soldiers and the battle mage, buying time for her fallen teammates with a desperation that looked nothing like the effortless legend the whole academy worshipped. I could see, even from a distance, the toll the fight had already taken. Her formation was ragged, her breathing visible even from 30 meters away, a shallow cut along her left forearm dripping blood she hadn't had a spare second to acknowledge. The battle mage was chanting something layered and complex, the kind of incantation that took real concentration to interrupt, and 2 of the soldiers were already circling wide to flank her, while the rest held her attention dead ahead. Even an SS rank prodigy has limits. Even the girl everyone assumed was untouchable bleeds when 9 trained soldiers surround her at once, and a battle mage is counting down the seconds until his spell finishes forming. I didn't have a sword. I didn't have combat training. What I had was a field that stretched exactly to the boundary where she was fighting, and roots that had spent 5 months learning exactly how to grip, anchor, and hold. I planted both palms flat against the earth, and for the first time, asked my class to do something violent. Sovereign Soil, Tier 3, threshold reached under combat stress. New skill unlocked, Tide of Roots, active, AOE. Tide of Roots, command the earth within root speak range to erupt, ensnare and submerge hostile targets to waist depth. Effectiveness scales with soil vitality, INT, and caster willpower. The ground didn't just move, it rose, a wave of dark, churned earth surging outward from where I stood, exactly the way I'd imagined a flood might move if a flood could think, could target, could choose. It swallowed the Empire soldiers to the waist in a single motion, roots snapping up from beneath them like the field itself had been waiting years for permission to defend its people. The battle mage, mid-incantation, went down hardest, dragged under so fast his spell fizzled into a harmless spark, the half-formed magic circle beneath him collapsing into scattered, useless light. The 2 soldiers who'd been circling to flank Arya never completed the maneuver. The earth took their legs out from under them before they'd covered half the distance, roots lushing up out of ground that should have been ordinary farmland and wrapping their limbs with the patient, implacable strength of something that had been waiting 2 centuries for exactly this purpose. I felt every one of those roots as an extension of my own nervous system. The strain of holding 9 grown men at once, the specific, addictive satisfaction of soil obeying a will it had apparently been starving for, since the wall behind it went quiet. My knees nearly buckled from the effort. I'd never pushed Tide of Roots across this much ground, this many targets, this much resistance, and the system's warning flared bright and urgent at the edge of my vision. Warning: mana expenditure critical, sustained output beyond recommended threshold, continued use may result in class overextension. I held anyway. Long enough for the soldiers to stop struggling, long enough for the battle mage's half-formed spell to die completely, long enough for the immediate threat to Arya Langley to end without another drop of her blood hitting the ground. For one suspended, silent moment, the only sound was Arya Langley's ragged breathing and 9 soldiers screaming into dirt that held them like iron chains. She turned to look at me, golden blade still lit, grey eyes wide with something I couldn't immediately name, and I realized, standing there with my hands still pressed into churned soil, that the girl the entire kingdom had been trained to worship was looking at me the way the market crowd once looked at her. "You're the farmer," she said, breathless, disbelieving. It was the second time in this story someone had said that exact phrase to me. It landed entirely differently this time. "Kaito," I said. "Kaito Mizuno." She looked past me at the field, roots still humming with restrained violence, grain stalks swaying undisturbed in the same soil that had just swallowed an armed squad, and something in her expression cracked open, reassessed, rebuilt itself in real time. "They laughed at your class at the ceremony," she said slowly. "Most people do," I said. I didn't laugh. Her voice was quieter now, the adrenaline of the fight fading into something more raw. I remember thinking it didn't make sense. Your status window had too much behind it for an F rank. She looked back at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, since anyone at the academy had met her, Arya Langley looked less like the untouchable legend and more like a 17-year-old girl who'd nearly died and was still shaking from it. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." "You'd have held," I said, because it felt true. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She was quiet for a moment, looking down at the roots still coiled around the bound soldiers, then back at me, grey eyes searching my face like she was trying to reconcile the boy she'd dismissed at the ceremony with the person standing in front of her now. "Everyone at the academy has spent 5 months treating you like an afterthought," she said, quieter now, the battlefield adrenaline giving way to something more raw. I let them. I never joined in, but I never stopped it either. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere with how other people ranked each other. She shook her head slightly, something like shame crossing her expression. "I don't think I get to tell myself that anymore." "You don't owe me an apology for a system you didn't build," I said. "Maybe not." Her hand went unconsciously to the shallow cut along her forearm, wincing slightly. "But I owe you an honest look at least. And an honest look tells me the entire ceremony hall was wrong about what your class actually was. And I was too comfortable at the top of that hierarchy to ever question it before today." She managed a tired, genuine smile, nothing like the practiced composure she wore for admiring crowds. "For what it's worth, Kaito Mizuno, I'd rather stand in a field with a farmer who actually understands the ground he's standing on than every storm night in that academy combined." I didn't have a smooth answer for that. I just felt something warm settle in my chest that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with being seen, clearly, for the first time by someone the entire kingdom had trained itself to admire from a careful, worshipful distance. Sora and Elena arrived minutes later, Sora with her sword drawn and ready for a fight that no longer needed fighting, sharp eyes taking in the churned battlefield, and the 9 soldiers bound waist-deep in roots, with a single raised eyebrow that somehow conveyed both approval and concern in equal measure. Elena was already moving before Sora had finished assessing the scene, dropping to her knees beside the wounded squad members with healing light already gathering at her palms, murmuring the quiet, efficient reassurances of someone who trained for exactly this kind of crisis and refused to let panic slow her hands. "Petron's rib is cracked, not shattered," she said after a moment, working quick, practiced magic over his chest. "He'll need 3 days of rest, not a funeral. The other 2 are worse, but stable." She glanced up at me, at the field still humming faintly with restrained mana, at the bound soldiers, and something complicated passed behind her eyes, relief, and a healer's particular fear of a power she hadn't fully catalogued yet. "Kaito, how much mana did that cost you?" "More than I've ever spent," I admitted, and only then noticed my hands were shaking. Sora crouched in front of the nearest bound soldier, studying his uniform insignia with a focus that had nothing to do with mercy. "Kestrel regulars," she confirmed grimly. "Not mercenaries, not border bandits dressed up to look official. Real Empire soldiers, this deep into Verendine territory, wearing scout markings that don't match any registered reconnaissance unit." She looked up at me. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't opportunistic. Someone sent trained soldiers specifically to map this corridor, and they picked the exact week the Academy's advanced cohort would be training nearby, which means either terrible luck or very good intelligence on the Empire's part. Guild reinforcements followed within the hour, a squad of silver rank hunters and 2 Academy proctors arriving to take the bound soldiers into custody, cutting them free of the roots, one careful captive at a time, while Sora oversaw the process with the flat, professional efficiency of someone who'd done this exact procedure more times than she cared to count. The battle mage, once conscious, refused to speak. The soldiers gave nothing beyond name and rank, which Sora said quietly was itself a kind of confirmation. Untrained bandits broke under pressure. Disciplined Imperial regulars didn't, even when captured deep in enemy territory. This wasn't a rogue scouting party, Sora told me later, once the guild had taken the prisoners away and the field had gone quiet again. This was reconnaissance for something larger. Someone in the Kestrel military wanted to know exactly how defended this corridor actually is, and now they know the answer includes something they weren't expecting at all. Me, I said. You, she agreed. Which means, Kaito, that whatever comes through that pass next isn't going to underestimate this field the way the Academy did. But in that immediate aftermath, in the churned, root-tangled dirt of my grandfather's flooded, worthless joke of a field, something else had been decided that had nothing to do with the coming war. Arya Langley didn't go back to the Academy dorms that night. She stayed at the edge of my field until dusk, watching the roots slowly settle back into stillness, asking careful, genuine questions about a class she'd spent 5 months hearing mocked in every hallway she walked. I want to understand this, she said finally as the sun set. Not because I owe you, because I think everyone at that ceremony was wrong, and I want to know exactly how wrong. I didn't have an answer that felt adequate, so I just said, "Stay and find out then." She did. Chapter 5. What the whole kingdom got wrong. Word travels fast when an SS rank prodigy is rescued by an F rank joke class, and it travels faster still when the story involves an ambush that guild officials were quietly hoping to keep quiet. Within a week, everyone at Aldrich Academy knew 3 things: that Arya Langley's squad had been attacked by Empire regulars disguised as scouts, that she'd survived because of intervention from an unlikely source, and that the unlikely source was, unbelievably, Kaito Mizuno, the farmer. The reaction split cleanly along the same lines the ceremony crowd had split 5 months earlier, except now, the mockery had nowhere safe to land. Cassius Wainwright predictably tried first. "Convenient timing," he said, cornering me outside the lecture hall with 2 of his usual companions flanking him. The same cruel smile from the ceremony floor stretched thin over something that looked, underneath, like genuine unease. Farmer saves the SS prodigy. Almost like a fairy tale, isn't it? Except fairy tales don't usually explain how a rank F class drowns 9 trained soldiers in dirt. "I could show you," I said, "if you'd like a demonstration." Something in my voice must have carried more weight than I intended, because Cassius's smile faltered for the first time since I'd known him. His companions shifted uncomfortably. He didn't take me up on the offer. Reputation threshold routing Aldrich Academy, student body, neutral to cautiously respectful. Cassius, at least, was the predictable kind of trouble, the kind I'd already learned to weather. The Academy's formal inquiry into the ambush was a different matter entirely, and it was there that I first properly met Damien Cross. The inquiry convened 3 days after the attack, in a chamber I'd never had reason to enter before, a formal hearing room beneath the Academy's central tower, reserved for matters the faculty considered serious enough to require sworn testimony rather than gossip. Guild representatives sat alongside Academy proctors, and Arya, Elena, and I were all called to give separate accounts of what had happened at the border. It was there, waiting my turn outside the chamber doors, that I first saw the boy the entire kingdom's military academies had been quietly grooming for command since the age of 12. Damien Cross was tall in the specific, deliberate way that came from a childhood spent training rather than growing carelessly, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the kind of stillness that read less like calm and more like coiled readiness. His class, awarded at his own ceremony 2 years prior at a different academy entirely, was Blade Marshal, rank S, a command-oriented combat class that came with innate tactical bonuses for any squad he led. He'd transferred to Aldrich's that same year Arya had, ostensibly for advanced strategic training, though everyone understood the actual reason. The Academy wanted its 2 highest-ranked prodigies training in the same halls, in case a future royal order needed them to serve together. He looked at me the way a general looks at an unfamiliar variable in an otherwise settled equation. "You're the farmer," he said. 3rd time. I was starting to recognize the phrase as less a statement and more a kind of ritual the world seemed determined to make me endure. "Kaito Mizuno," I said. I read the incident report. His voice was even, controlled, entirely without the sneering edge Cassius always carried. That, somehow, made it more unsettling. 9 Kestrel regulars neutralized without a single fatality, using an ability the Array Registry has no complete record of. Arya Langley alive because of intervention from a rank F support class. He studied me for a long moment. Either that report is wrong, or everything the Academy has taught about class hierarchy for the last 2 centuries needs to be reconsidered. I don't like reconsidering things I've spent my life training around. That sounds like a problem you'll have to solve, I said, not me. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger exactly. Calculation. Maybe, he said. Or maybe it means the Empire's scouting party wasn't the only party in this kingdom that needs to reassess the battlefield. He turned to go, then paused. I don't dismiss Arya's account of what happened. I dismiss coincidence. A dead class line resurfacing in a rank F farmer, on the exact border corridor Imperial intelligence has apparently started probing. In the same season, Guild scouts confirmed troop buildups along the eastern passes. He met my eyes directly. I don't believe in coincidences that convenient, Mizuno. I intend to find out what you actually are before the Empire does. He left without waiting for a response, and I stood there in that corridor with the distinct, uncomfortable sense that I'd just made an acquaintance far more dangerous than Cassius Wainwright's petty cruelty had ever been. Not an enemy exactly. Not yet. But a mind sharp enough to see through every careful lie Sora had coached me into telling. The inquiry itself concluded with the Academy officially crediting swift intervention by a student combatant for the survival of Arya's squad, deliberately vague language that Sora had lobbied guild contacts to insist upon, protecting the specifics of my class from becoming a matter of permanent public record. It wouldn't hold forever. Damian Cross, I suspected, was already working on undoing that vagueness one careful question at a time. I won't pretend the mockery vanished overnight. Rank still mattered to most people at that school, and a rumor, however dramatic, doesn't undo 5 months of institutional contempt in a week. But something had shifted, unmistakably. People stopped laughing when the word farmer came up. They started instead asking questions. Quiet, careful, half-embarrassed questions about what exactly my class could do. Questions I mostly deflected, because Sora had made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that broadcasting the full extent of my abilities to an academy full of nobility with their own agendas was a good way to end up owned by someone else's ambitions before I'd finished growing into my own. Elena's diagnostic instincts turned out to matter more than either of us expected. In the weeks following the ambush, she ran deeper readings on my mana signature and made a discovery that reframed everything I thought I understood about my own class. Your class isn't just rare, she told me, poring over notes in the healing hall after hours, voice hushed even though we were alone. It's old. Older than the current registry system. I cross-referenced the name, Sovereign Soil, against the Academy's restricted archive, the one they only let senior healers access. She looked up at me, and I saw something like awe underneath the clinical caution. There's a fragmented reference to a class line called the Root Sovereigns, tied to an empire that predates the Kestrel dynasty by at least 3 centuries. The records say the line was lost after a war that flooded half a continent. She paused. I think your class isn't a support-tier oddity, Kaito. I think it's the last surviving echo of something the current array registry doesn't even remember how to classify properly, which is why it defaulted to labeling it farmer. The lowest tier it had a name for. She pulled out a folded page of careful notes, her handwriting cramped and urgent in the margins. The restricted archive only had fragments. Most of the original texts were lost when the Old Kingdom fell, and what survived came through second-hand religious accounts rather than proper array records, so I'd treat it with caution. But the pattern in what remains is consistent. The Root Sovereigns weren't farmers in the sense this kingdom uses the word now. They were the class the old empire built its entire border strategy around. Living fortifications, essentially, capable of turning contested farmland into terrain no invading army could safely cross. One account describes an entire military campaign ending not because of any battle, but because a single root sovereign made a river delta swallow a supply column whole. She looked up at me. The line went extinct, or was believed to, after a war that the surviving texts only ever called the flooding. Whatever caused it, the empire that trained root sovereigns doesn't exist anymore, and the knowledge of how to recognize or cultivate the class died with it. Which is exactly why the modern array, inheriting an incomplete registry, slotted your soul potential into the nearest surviving category it still had a name for. Farmer, I said. Farmer, Elena agreed quietly. The closest word left in a system that forgot what it used to mean. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. Not proof, not certainty, but a shape that fit everything I'd felt since the ceremony. The strange, out-of-place power in a system that should have understood exactly what it was giving me, and clearly hadn't. So what do I do with that? I asked. Elena's expression turned serious in a way I hadn't seen from her before. You get stronger, carefully. You let people underestimate you exactly as long as that's useful, and not one day longer. And you remember that the Empire scouting party wasn't hunting Arya Langley specifically. Guild intelligence thinks they were mapping the flood corridor defenses. She met my eyes. Which means whatever's coming next isn't finished with your field, Kaito. It's just getting started. Sora, when I told her what Elena had found, was characteristically unsentimental about it. Old bloodline, ancient empire, lost class line, doesn't change the training schedule. Doesn't change the fact that the wall behind your field needs 3 more months of anchoring before it could hold against a real siege push, and we might not have 3 more months. She studied me for a moment, something almost approving in her expression. But it does explain why I felt like I was training someone who already half knew what I was about to teach him before I said it. Arya stayed close in those weeks too, in a way that surprised the whole academy more than the rescue itself had. She started training on my field in the early mornings before classes, not out of obligation, but out of what she eventually admitted was simple, stubborn curiosity. The same instinct, I realized later, that had made her the only person besides Elena and Sora who hadn't laughed at the ceremony. She'd spent her whole life being the person everyone assumed would win before the fight started. Watching a rank F class nearly break an entire ambush squad by itself had cracked something open in her. Not jealousy, but a kind of hungry, humbled fascination with a kind of strength she hadn't been trained to recognize. Those mornings developed their own quiet rhythm. Arya would arrive before the sun fully cleared the eastern ridge, sword sheathed, boots damp with dew. And instead of the effortless confidence she wore like armor everywhere else at the academy, she asked questions here. Real questions. The kind that came from someone unused to not already knowing the answer. How do you know how hard to pull? She asked once, watching me test root anchor against the stack of practice logs Sora had hauled out for exactly this purpose. With a blade, I feel the resistance the instant steel meets steel. This looks like you're gripping something you can't even see. I can see it, I told her. Just not with my eyes. I tried to find words for a sense I'd never had to explain to anyone before this year. It's like, you know the weight of your own sword without looking at it, right? You just know, because your arm has held it 1,000 times. Root speak is like that. Except the sword is the ground for 30 meters in every direction, and it's been getting heavier. No, not heavier. Clearer. Every day I understand it a little more precisely. She was quiet for a moment, watching the logs shift under invisible pressure. I trained 12 hours a day since I was 6 years old, she said finally. Sword forms before breakfast, footwork drills until my legs gave out. Everyone always told me it was talent, that the array simply recognized what years of discipline had built into me. She looked at the field, then at me. Your class did something with 17 years I can't fully account for, and it terrifies me a little, honestly, how much sense it makes once you explain it. Like strength was never really about what people expected it to look like. Everyone at that ceremony saw a joke, she told me one morning, watching barley grow at an impossible rate under my palm. I think I'm the only one who's glad I was wrong about what kind of joke it was. By the end of that month, 4 people knew the truth behind the farmer everyone had mocked. A healer cataloging a lost bloodline. A hunter training a partner for a war the guild hadn't officially declared yet. an SS rank prodigy relearning what strength actually looked like, and me, still standing in the same flooded joke of a field my grandfather left behind, feeling the roots of a 2-century-old wall stir awake beneath my feet, one season closer to whatever the Kestrel Empire was planning to send through this valley next. Sovereign soil, Tier 3 stabilized, Tier 4 threshold, locked, requirement, withstand a full siege engagement. I read that notification standing at the edge of the old boundary wall, Sora beside me with her arms crossed, Elena's careful notes tucked under one arm, Arya's golden blade catching the morning light a few paces off. 4 months, maybe less, before the guild's worst estimates came due. I put my palm against 2 centuries of buried stone and felt it answer, the way the soil had answered on the first night I'd sat alone with my shame and found something else underneath it. Somewhere to the east, past the mountain passes the Hunters Guild had been quietly watching for months, I knew now that a Kestrel Empire general named Craig Valdor was almost certainly reviewing the same failed reconnaissance report Sora had described to me. A report that would tell him nothing about who or what had swallowed his scouting party into the earth, only that something in this valley had teeth nobody in his command structure had accounted for. I didn't know his face yet. I didn't know how many soldiers marched under his banner, or how soon the guild's cautious 4-month estimate would collapse into something far more urgent. I only knew, standing at the edge of that ancient wall with 3 people beside me who had each, in their own way, chosen to see past the word farmer, that whatever came through this corridor next would be walking into ground that remembered exactly how to defend itself. They had laughed at a locked door. They were coming for this valley, had no idea what was about to open.